Hello everyone and welcome to a video on the Constructive Criticism YouTube channel. I'm Spencer, host of Constructive Criticism and Limited Time Only, two podcasts about getting better at Magic the Gathering. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today is another deck tech. We're really excited to talk about Modern. And I'm really excited to talk about this deck. It's something that I've been trying a little bit. I usually play Modern about once a week, if not, depending on the season. Sometimes I'll play a little bit more. And the deck that I've been playing for the last 2 weeks is something that I'm kind of excited about. And that's green-blue Merfolk. So, back in the day, I was kind of a Merfolk aficionado in Legacy specifically, and I have tried the deck in Modern quite a few times. I've tried Red Merfolk, I've tried Blue Merfolk with different variations in Modern, and one of the things that I really liked is just how unprepared people can be for Merfolk, and I think that they've never been more unprepared in their lives for the things that this new Merfolk deck offers. You know, you've seen the deck do well at multiple Modern events recently, as well as some 5.0s online. And I want to talk about Blue-Green Merfolk and some of the things that the new set adds to this deck that people really aren't prepared for. So let's kind of go over the main deck first and talk a little bit about some of the cards. So the first thing we have is 4 main deck Aether Vials. So Aether Vial is never been better in this deck, to be quite honest. Very early versions of Merfolk in Modern actually didn't play Aether Vial. It's actually one of the reasons that I didn't play the deck in Modern early on is because, you know, people just weren't playing this card. They were just trying to get in with their Merfolk. This card wasn't a part of it. And I think that with some of the new additions, Aether Vial's kind of at an all-time high. You get to play more 1-drops, you get to play more 2-drops, and you get a lot more value out of your Vials and your Vial draws because of the kind of cards that you're playing. So 4 Aether Vial, I think, is a great start. The next thing that we have is actually 4 Cursecatchers. Sorry, that's the wrong card. 4 Cursecatchers. So I know that the list that just did well at the SEG was actually not playing Cursecatcher. And I do actually think that that's incorrect. I think that Cursecatcher does so much for the deck and what it's trying to do by disrupting your opponent while having an immediate game plan, that you can't afford not to play them. And I also think that the power of your Aether Vials goes up significantly when you have both 4 Cursecatchers and the new 1-drop that we're going to talk about. I have 2 Harbinger of Tides. This is a card that I am constantly unimpressed with. I know a lot of people really like this card. They like... I mean, this card is a 4 of everywhere. And honestly, I just don't think it's that great. I think that you want a couple of them. It adds to your main game plan as well as some disruption. But I really don't think that this is a 4 of you want in this deck, as honestly, it's kind of clunky in the spots where you don't want it. And you don't need that many of it to do the thing that you're trying to do. We do have 1 Kopala, Warden of Waves. It's one of the newest cards coming out of Ixalan. And this card is so good. So, early on, I talked about how I thought this card would make an impact in Modern and Legacy inside the Merfolk decks. I think that it is, in fact, better than Kira the Great Glass Splinter. And I think that I'm right. I think that, making your opponent's spells cost more does basically the same thing as countering them the first time around. Especially in a deck like this, where you can flash this in, and make them pay an additional 2 for all of their spells. So I really like this card. I really like what it does for the deck. I like it as specifically a 1 of in the main, 1 of in the board, and I think that, it getting pumped, and the fact that there's so few lightning bolts that makes this so much better, because people's removal spell of choice is actually Fatal Push, they don't get to target this first very often. Unless they have a fetch land in play. This card just it's pretty good. I'm pretty impressed with it. We did talk about the 1-drop that we talked about earlier. This is I'm going to get this wrong, but Kumena's Speaker, being able to control a Merfolk or an island is basically the easiest thing in the world in this deck. And I think that having 4 of these and 4 Cursecatchers just makes your Aether Vial so powerful, because it means that when you play it on turn 1, you're not taking a turn off to get to a 2-drop very often. You actually can pretty often have a 1-drop in your hand and get that Vial activation while playing a 2-drop on turn 2. And that is so powerful, especially when they have to guess whether it's a Cursecatcher or a Speaker. Because if they're playing an instant or sorcery to try and remove the 2-drop that you're playing that turn, they have to guess whether or not you have that Cursecatcher to protect it. And if they're playing around it, then you just get a flash in a Speaker, and you're so far ahead. Speaker easily becomes a 3/3 in this deck because of all the lords in the deck. And, what more do you want in your deck other than a 1-mana 3/3? Wild Nacatl is good for a reason, and this card acts as a Wild Nacatl in this deck pretty often. We do have the 4 Lord of Atlantis. I think that basically 4 Lord of Atlantis, 4 Master of the Pearl Trident are pretty obvious inclusions in this deck. And you really, really want to maximize those lords. I've seen lists that even play things like Cornwall Commander or more Phantasmal Image to try and maximize the number of lords that you get to play. I think that's a little bit better in Legacy, where you can protect your guys a little better with things like Force of Will and Daze. Not quite as good here. I do want both of those, right? 4 of each of them. But I think that because of some of the new additions, it even makes these guys a little bit better. And one of those new additions is Merfolk Branchwalker. Being a 2-drop that explores, either coming down as a 3/2 or getting that land off the top of your deck and putting it in your hand to draw a card, it's pretty powerful. And when you don't want that card, it's basically the same thing as drawing a card, right? Because you got to put it into your graveyard so you don't have to draw it. And it is like an additional Silvergill Adept. Silvergill Adept is another card that you really, really enjoyed playing in this deck because it gives you value. And the value between it and Merfolk Branchwalker is they're just powerful effects that get you through your deck faster, put a lot of pressure on your opponent, because it's very easy for you to have a Lord in play right after they come into play and really put the beatdowns onto your opponent, all while having things like Cursecatcher into play. Maybe you have a Harbinger of Tides to back it up, or some of the other spells that we might talk about in the future. And the last card that we have is 2 Merrow Reejereys. So Merrow Reejerey is a card that I have never really liked. Whether it's the other blue one Merfolk that makes your guys unblockable or other things, Merrow Reejerey's always been a little underpowered to me. Its main power comes from when you get to untap an Aether Vial. And, Aether Vial, you just put the creature into play, right? So you don't actually get to cast the card. And I've always found like those Aether Vial draws, while they're great, to be a little bit underwhelming. But I do see the fact that this deck is a better Aether Vial deck than most Merfolk decks. And because of that, I'm willing to play Merrow Reejerey in those kind of decks. And I think that it does a lot compared to what it would normally do. Because your Aether Vials are so much better in this deck, because of the mana curve considerations, once you play your 3-drop, you will probably have multiple 2s in your hand. And so Aether Vial becomes a lot better. The first spell that we have is Force Spreading Seas. This is basically a land destruction spell that replaces itself, all while making your other Merfolk unblockable through Island Walk, through Master of the Pearl Trident, and Lord of Atlantis. And I really do think that once people started main decking this card, they quickly went back to Aether Vial. Because what you started to do is you started to say, I'm going to play Vial on 1, seize you on 2, and then start to advance my board while you're trying to rebuild from your mana. And that's become a really powerful plan and something that I've really enjoyed out of this deck. It's very good against the Tron decks, it's very good against the Volakut decks, and it's also surprisingly good against some of those Grixis Death Shadow decks, as their mana is a huge part of their game plan. And once you Spreading Sea them once, it's really hard for them to catch up because they really count on that black mana source, or they really count on that red mana source, and you really get an advantage through that. All the while advancing your game plan through getting closer to your lords and also making them, I'm going to say indestructible again, I'm not sure why, but making them unblockable through Island Walk by turning their card into an island. We do have 2 Dismember, 1 Spell Pierce, and 1 Vapor Snag as our disruption spells. I wish that I had more room for things. I actually wish that I had room for 2 of all of these spells. I think that you want a mix of some number of these, depending on your metagame. I could see wanting 0 Vapor Snags and 2 Spell Pierce. I could see wanting 0 Dismembers in the main, wanting 2 Spell Pierce and 2 Vapor Snag. That's actually what I had a week ago, and it kind of just depends on what you expect. Vapor Snag is something that, if you're playing a very heavy tempo game, you want a lot of. If you'll notice the list from 4th place this weekend to the Open, it had 2 Dismember in the main deck specifically. And I do think that there is a combination of these that's going to be very powerful for you, and these are the 3 spells that you should be looking at. We do have 19 lands. I think that the mana base is pretty streamlined at this point, or at least pretty close to so. One thing that I am doing a little bit differently is I do think that you don't need Cavern of Souls. So I have 4 Botanical Sanctum, 2 Breeding Pool, 2 Flooded Strand, 4 Island, 4 Mutavault, and 3 Polluted Delta. I know that the first list that came out also had no Cavern of Souls, but it also didn't have very Mutavaults. I think that it kind of just depends on what you expect, but you could easily play Cavern of Souls in this deck if you wanted to, maybe cutting down on the number of fetch lands, maybe just playing a total of 4 of them, cutting an island here or there, things like that. I don't think that you want the forest in the main deck. I know that that's something that people have talked about on Reddit and on Twitter. I think that the reason that the fetch lands are so powerful is because it in fact gives you lots of ways to get that breeding pool into play, which acts as an island and a forest for your speaker. And I think that your speaker is surprisingly a huge part of this new deck. So in the sideboard, we have 3 Relic of Progenitus. This kind of helps you against most of the graveyard strategies. And honestly, I think that I like it better than Graphic Digger's Cage right now. I don't expect a lot of collected company decks, so I think that this is just the more powerful effect. I have 1 Sorcerous Spyglass. I've been weirdly impressed with this. Being able to see their hand before you name a card has been surprisingly powerful. And yeah, it's just been surprisingly good. I could see not wanting this. Maybe you play something like another Negate or another Dismember or something along those lines, or maybe even something like a Beast Within or a Naturalize effect. I'm not quite sure. Maybe you think that you have a bad affinity matchup, so what you really want is something like Creeping Corrosion or something like that. And I think that this slot is kind of flexible. I do have the second Kopala in the sideboard. Like I said before, I think this card is really powerful. It really allows you to interact with your opponents in a meaningful way, and stop them from interacting with you. You get to put power onto the board while impacting all of your cards, and it's so much more power than something like Kira would be, and that's why I'm really a big fan of it. We have 3 Ceremonious Rejection. I think this card is at an all-time high, whether it's the Eldrazi Tron decks, whether it's the actual Tron decks. I think that this card is something that you really want in your deck, and it's also something that you get to sideboard against Affinity, which can sometimes be a rougher matchup for you. We do have the third Dismember in the board. I think that this is another one that you could flex on if you wanted another Spell Pierce, if you wanted another Negate. You can definitely decide what you think you want at this point in the metagame, depending on what's close to you. Right now, I have a Dismember. We do have the 3 Natural State, another concession to the fact that sometimes Affinity can be rough, but also sometimes maybe you need to play around Blood Moon. Maybe there's enchantments that you really don't want to deal with. Things like that. And I think that most of the things you want to deal with are going to be 3 or less, and that's why Natural State's on the board. We have 2 Negates. This card has been really impressive for me. I know that some people have even gone up to 3 of these. I know that some people also play Dispel instead of this. I think that your deck plays enough off of Aether Vial that you can afford the 2 mana, and I've been pretty happy with it. We also have the last Vapor Snag. This is another flex one. I think that if you want this in the main, you want to take both those Dismember in the board and this and turn them into Spell Pierces, you can do that. I think that that's completely reasonable and a place that you can kind of decide as to what does my metagame look like, what are the sideboard cards that I want, and what are the disruption spells that I want in my 75, and Vapor Snag, Dismember in the board, as well as Spell Pierce, Vapor Snag, and Dismember in the main are kind of flex spots that you get to play with. So that's it for Blue-Green Merfolk this week. Please leave a comment, let me know what you think. I've been enjoying this deck. It's something that I've been having a lot of fun with, and I think that it's been doing really well on different circuits and different areas of Magic that I don't think that people expected when they saw this set. I don't think that they thought that it would make an impact in Modern, but it's changing a deck that's been a Modern staple for a little while. So thank you everybody for watching. Don't forget to go to patreon.com/ccmtg to become a patron of this show and all of our other content. You can also check out Flipside Gaming, where it also sponsors this podcast, this video, all of the content around here. And use the code CCMTG at checkout to get a small percentage off your order, and then they give me a little bit of a kickback. So thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you guys all next week.